Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is George Nearsu. I'm the MLA for the Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning. I'm Shauna Morgan. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North.
Ms. Yakalaya.
Oh, good morning. My name is Cheryl Yakalaya. I'm the member for the DETRO in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and as always, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, this briefing is a part of this committee study on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. Okay. Please note this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channel. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. I will now pass it over to Federal Housing Advocate. Please proceed with your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair. My name is Marie-Josée Houle, and I'm honored to join you today. Je m'appelle Marie-Josée Houle, et je suis honorée de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the privilege of speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I also honor the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from coast to coast to coast. This land acknowledgement is a commitment to the relationship we are building with Indigenous peoples, one based on friendship, peace, mutual respect, and reconciliation. And as I speak these words as Canada's first federal housing advocate, I think it's really important for me personally to take pause, to really think about what this means and how it influences my work every single day. So I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak to you today as Canada's first federal housing advocate. And I'm here as this committee is exploring an important question. What does a right to housing mean for law and policies in the Northwest Territories? And I'm encouraged to hear that the study will help to inform the government of the Northwest Territories on how housing as a human right can be applied here in the territory. Because really, this comes down to one important fact. Housing is a fundamental human right, and housing is maybe the most fundamental of all human rights. Having a safe, dignified place to call home is one of the most basic human needs. And the right to housing is connected to so many other human rights, you know, the right to education, to physical and mental health, to political participation, and even the right to life. And governments have an essential role to play in making sure that every person can have their right to housing upheld. So in my remarks today, I'm going to touch on three topics. First, I'll provide an overview of Canada's human rights architecture, including my role as federal housing advocate. Second, I want to cover what recognizing the right to housing means for governments and why it matters. And finally, I will touch on what the right to housing looks like in Canada today and where we go from here. So to my first point, Canada has recognized housing as a human right in federal law, and I want to unpack what that means as well as what my role entails. And the human right to housing is more than just four walls and a roof. It is a right that is defined in international law. The right to adequate housing means that all people are equally entitled to live in dignity, in a safe and secure home, and that everyone should be able to access housing that meets their needs without discrimination or harassment. And under international law, housing must meet 7 conditions to be considered adequate. And that criteria includes being protected from forced eviction, being affordable, being habitable with enough room for the inhabitants, It must provide basic services like clean water and sanitation, and it must be accessible for people of all abilities in a location that provides access to basic services, and it must be culturally appropriate. Housing advocates tirelessly campaigned for years to have Canada recognize the human right to adequate housing, and their work led to the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. And the Act recognizes and enshrines housing as a human right in Canada's federal law. It also creates important accountability mechanisms to uphold the right to housing, including the National Housing Strategy, the National Housing Council, and the role of the Federal Housing Advocate. Amplifying the voices of people in vulnerable housing circumstances is at the heart of my work as federal housing advocate. And the work my team and I are doing is about ensuring that the voices of people in Canada are heard by decision makers at the highest levels. As a housing rights watchdog, my role is to hold all levels of government, in particular the federal government, to account for their human rights obligations. And my office and I are independent and nonpartisan, which is why we're based at the Canadian Human Rights Commission and not a federal department. The Act also makes it clear that my role is to focus on systemic housing issues. I make recommendations to governments to improve laws, policies, and programs so they uphold the right to housing and improve outcomes for people in Canada. And the advocate's role also includes conducting research, reviewing systemic issues, engaging with rights holders and civil society, monitoring the situation in Canada, and raising concerns with the federal minister responsible for housing. It's important to recognize that my role does not provide a recourse mechanism for individual complaints, but rather I'm here to amplify the concerns and solutions of people experiencing homelessness and inadequate housing to federal government, which is legally obligated to respond to my recommendations. So one of the areas of focus has been housing in Canada's north. In October of 22, I traveled to Nunavut and Nunatsiavut in partnership with Nunavut Tunngavik Inc. and Nunatsiavut government to learn more about housing in Inuit communities and visit people and organizations firsthand. And the housing conditions there are dire, and the results of a failure by multiple levels of government to invest in and respect the human right to housing for Inuit. Our co-developed report documents these conditions and at the same time identifies long-term and sustainable solutions and a roadmap of recommendations to governments. We've met with federal ministers, MPs, and senators to discuss the report, and we also engage with the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador on the recommendations that can be implemented in the province. And the report continues to be an advocacy tool that we're using to engage with the federal, provincial, and territorial governments on these critical issues and push for action. And this is a great example of how the federal housing advocate is an important connector. Bringing people together is how we'll continue to make progress on the right to housing. Second, I want to cover what recognizing the right to housing means for governments and why it matters. In addition to setting out what the human right to housing is, both international human rights law and the National Housing Strategy Act set out a standard on how it should be achieved. They use the term progressive realization, and this phrase acknowledges that solving these problems won't be immediate. But progressively realizing the right to housing means that governments need to take steps forward to uphold this right. It provides a human rights lens that helps to frame how governments should respond to inadequate housing and homelessness. And progressive realization stipulates that governments are obligated to take immediate action, use maximum available resources, and prioritize most disadvantaged groups. And recognizing housing as a human right doesn't mean that governments have to hand out homes to everyone or even solve homelessness tomorrow. But it does mean, however, that they have to create the conditions for everyone to have access to adequate housing and work meaningfully towards that goal. And the fact is, incorporating human rights-based approaches into housing policy is a smart decision for governments. You know, a top-down approach never works when addressing systemic issues. But a human rights-based approach provides better outcomes for people. It asks people what they need, and it makes sure those needs are met. This involves meaningfully engaging with people affected at all stages in identifying the issues, finding solutions, and implementing programs. And a human rights-based approach makes projects more meaningful and more successful. You know, in the end, it really does save money in the long run. So when everyone has affordable and adequate housing, the economy and so many other areas benefit, and it allows people to thrive and to reach their full potential. A human rights-based approach also focuses on groups with the greatest housing need, including people with lived experience of housing need and homelessness. And it requires helping people who are experiencing the most harm as a first priority. So I want to give you an example of what that looks like in practice. Canada is experiencing an unprecedented encampments crisis, and people are living in tents because they have nowhere else to go. So last year, I launched a systemic review on this issue to better understand its realities and arrive at solutions. It was absolutely critical that I speak with people firsthand, people that are affected. And I met with encampments residents and community advocates in Montreal, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. I also received written submissions online from 313 people with lived experience in encampments. Another 53 advocates, organizations, and municipalities shared their perspectives and observations. And what I heard is that encampment residents know what is required to meet their most pressing needs. And above all, it comes down to having adequate housing. What's lacking is sufficient resources and coordination among governments, as well as the commitment to meaningfully engage with encampment residents. So my final report includes recommendations aimed at the federal government as well as provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. And I've been engaging with all levels of government as to how they can implement them in their jurisdictions. But in particular, I urge the federal government to lead the way on this issue by swiftly developing an encampments response plan. And I was pleased to see in the 24 budget that the federal government has set aside $250 million for human rights-based encampments responses, which can be matched by provinces and territories for up to $500 million in funding. And while the details about this plan are still emerging, I look forward to continued progress and its full implementation in communities across the country. And finally, I'll touch upon what the right to housing looks like in Canada today and where we go from here. The federal housing advocate's role is it's the only one in the world. And it's a model that centers deeply on advocacy. And having been in this role for 2.5 years, I have to say that listening firsthand to people who are most disadvantaged is what makes the advocate's role unique. And I think this gives the advocate a rare ability to make change. To me, advocacy means pushing for change alongside those who are most disadvantaged and whose voices are not reaching the decision makers. And those voices have too often been discredited by the usual mechanisms and policies. You know, the voices of people who are justice involved, who are struggling with addiction, who are racialized, who are Indigenous, gender diverse, women, and looking at systemic failures and not the failure of the individual is a really powerful framework. It helps not only getting to the heart of the issue and finding real solutions, but also to building trust with rights holders. It's a way of recalibrating the existing power structures that too often lead to human rights failures. So I'm unique in being a bridge between people with lived experience on the ground, organizations in the housing and homelessness sector, and decision makers that influence laws and policies. And I can build trust and speak to people that governments can't. And I can engage with people when governments do not have the time or the money. And at the same time, I'm an important resource for governments who can draw on my research and my work on the ground to guide their policy making. So I bring all of these groups together to find solutions that get to the root of housing and homelessness crisis. So recognizing the right to housing is an important first step that governments at the territorial, provincial, and municipal levels can take. But this recognition needs to be backed up by someone who can drive the progress. And to me, that looks like an independent territorial housing advocate who can help to realize this right. A territorial housing advocate can make sure that people who are most impacted by inadequate housing and homelessness are heard by decision makers. They can help make sure that the solutions governments are proposing are based in human rights and will make a difference in people's lives. And the territorial advocate's role can be created to identify systemic issues based on local priorities. And it can help local governments make sense of and adopt changes identified by the federal housing advocate calling for action across jurisdictions. An independent territorial housing advocate can hold governments of all political stripes accountable for respecting people's right to housing, and recognizing the right to housing must come with tools to uphold it. So that's the importance of a territorial housing advocate. So what does the right to housing framework look like in Canada almost 5 years after passing the National Housing Strategy Act? Well, the Act gives us new tools to claim the right to housing. At the same time, there are limitations. The mechanism in the Acts, they don't have enforcement powers. It doesn't give people the ability to make a complaint to the government for violating their human right to housing. I can't use the law to force governments to change their ways. But that's why it's so critical that we have other levels of government like territories, provinces, municipalities, and Indigenous governments on board with the right to housing. And that's why it's important that they appoint their own housing advocates so that they are independent voices who can convene civil society and people with lived experience and continue to push for governments to uphold people's right to housing. And we need all governments to live up to their responsibility and to do their part to respect, protect, and willful the human right to adequate housing. You know, in the end, it really comes down to the fact that everyone has a role to play. So the government of Northwest Territories, you have a unique opportunity to be a leader on this issue. And I truly believe that recognizing and upholding housing as a human right is the path forward. I'm really appreciative. Thank you for inviting me to join you today, and I really look forward to your questions.
Okay. Ms. Wu, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Now I will ask members if they have any questions. Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madame Houle, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Part of our struggle with housing in the Northwest Territories is that like a significant portion of the housing that people rely on in pretty much all of our communities is public housing, most of which was originally built by the federal government, decades ago, and in some cases, people were pushed or forced into moving into public housing and away from where they would have lived and thrived before, and yet for decades now the federal government has been sort of gradually removing the funds that were in place before for even operating and maintaining the public housing that we have, let alone building new public housing. And so we see this rug that's been pulled out from underneath us. And I'm wondering if that removal of federal support is part of your advocacy, or if it's on your radar. I know you said you've been focusing on housing issues in the Northern Territories, and is that something that you can advocate to the federal government about, to sort of raise this awareness of this very difficult situation we're in with public housing in particular in the Northwest Territories?
Ms. Wu?
Thank you so much for that question. Absolutely. I think for most of the decision makers, they are in the South, and it costs so much to go to the North, which is why it was really important for me to prioritize going to the North firsthand right at the beginning of my mandate, to see for myself and to speak to people directly, also just recognizing that even though during the pandemic, we had found ourselves no longer able to travel, and we found different ways of being able to have meetings together. It was really eye-opening for me, I think, during the first years of the pandemic, to realize that even though we all have internet and we can use things like Zoom, I noticed who was missing, and it was still people from the north because of connectivity issues. It is hard to be wrapped up in our lives in the south and to really be aware of what's happening in the north. So, again, I think it's really important for my work as the federal housing advocate to bring light to what's happening in the north and remote areas, because it's so very different than what's happening in large urban centers and what's happening in the south in general. My first call to government in general, not just focusing on Indigenous housing issues, but in general, is that the federal government had stepped away from building non-market housing, their investments in non-market housing, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, and that has had a huge impact on the non-market housing sector, and has been one of the driving forces or reasons why we have such an affordability issue here. And the second one is, at the same time, relying on the private market to fill that space, which has not worked, but also the financialization of housing. I've been following the deputations in front of this committee over the last few weeks, and I learned a lot about non-market communities, which was fascinating to me, and it helped me develop a little bit of vocabulary around what I was witnessing. And the collision, I think, in some communities where they have a bit of, or the tension, where you have some market and mostly non-market communities. So, this is very unique to remote areas. You don't have that in large urban centers. So just getting to the heart of it, to be able to understand it and then make recommendations around it is huge. So although I'm not an expert about Northwest Territories, I've yet to go there. What I've witnessed in Inuit communities and Nunavut and Nunatsiavut, there's a lot of similarities, but then there's the role of the territorial governments as well as the Indigenous governments. So I can't say that my work is done, but just the general advocacy for more non-market housing, meaning public housing, housing co-ops, and not-for-profit, that has been a big point of advocacy for me across the country. Some of the programs coming out of CMHC, they work for large urban centers. We have to make sure that they also work for smaller communities, and to make sure that they have the ability to actually develop this housing as well and maintain it. So it's not just buildings up, we're done. Then there's the issue of how do you have subsidies for people who can't afford the rent even at a not-for-profit or rate. And then, so people with deep needs, and that's more pronounced, of course, in the non-market communities. And and in the end, also with the services. So it's not just, they need maintenance. They need capital maintenance as well. And then the supports for people. So now you've got a huge trench of things. And this is where the jurisdictional issue over who's responsible for what comes into play. And that's why we need not only an all-of-government approach, so it's not just ministers responsible for housing, but also ministers responsible for health, mental health, have to come to the table as well.
Ms. Morgan, do you have a follow-up? Okay, thank you. And Mr. Niersu?
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I think your position is, I think it's going to do a lot of jurisdictions good. Be good if they have a territorial housing advocate that can work on our behalf. We live in a unique environment. where the high cost of living is a big factor in building homes, new homes. The housing, NWT housing uses a Band-Aid solution. In my community of Fort McPherson, there's numerous homes that's over 50 years old and have been renovated numerous times. So those are inadequate living conditions. And also, I've always stated that prior to the government coming into our communities, we're strong and independent. And they came and said they're going to make our lives easier. And today it's totally the opposite. We're living in, some of us are living in third world conditions. You know, it's just unbelievable. We pay, homeowners pay high property taxes for land that we once owned within our communities. And the government are imposing these taxes on our people because they've taken over our community where we once owned them, and we lived our own lives. We're paying for our own water that we once used for free. And another factor that comes into housing is income assistance. It seems like Housing NWT is providing housing, and education, culture, and employment is paying for the bills. So they're not giving any incentive to these these tenants to work, because everything is just handed to them. So in my community of about 800 people, 15% of them are on income assistance. We've tried every avenue. We asked the government to impose, make some choices, productive choices, while they're collecting income assistance so they can work their way off and become more independent. But it's becoming very difficult to walk down the street and see a handful of people at work in offices, and whether it's the territorial government jobs or the municipal jobs. It's mostly the only jobs that's available, and the rest are on income assistance that cannot pay for to maintain their own homes, so they're stuck in these public housing units. So it'd be good to have it's more of a comment than anything. It'd be good to have a territorial housing advocate that can work with you and work for us to try and make things more better people for living conditions wise. Thank you.
Ms. Wu?
Well, thank you so much for that. And that is the challenge of a job of the federal housing advocate, is the country's so large. And, you know, even though I've done a little bit of work specifically in Inuit communities, and the goal is to do the 2 other regions as well, so we can take our reports and findings to the ICPC committee, you know, and I'm hoping to be able to do that if I get a second mandate. The reality is that there's also needs to be the capacity within these communities in order to assist me with this, you know, and I'm speaking specifically with Inuit communities, you know, because our approach to Indigenous housing, you know, which is a priority for me and always has been as the federal housing advocate, has been to try to decolonize the process. I'm all too aware that I have the term federal in my title. And so how do I do this and do this well? So for our approach to Indigenous housing has always been by invitation, and only by invitation, and that we, you know, the governments, Indigenous governments, will show me what they want me to see, will organize the visits, will have me speak to the people they want me to speak to, and that we co-write the recommendations in the report, and then the advocacy that happens. So it's not just a report done and we're moving on. The reports end up being advocacy tools for Indigenous governments, for myself, and for civil society, but that the advocacy is done in lockstep with Indigenous governments so that that are involved. So that that they take the lead, that I'm not charging forward, that it is what they're comfortable with. And with Inuit, they're very proud. So it had to be very important to me that I take on the tone that they want to take and that they're comfortable with, and that I'm not going to risk embarrassing them or speaking out of turn, and to provide that trust and that reassurance that I'm here to support what they prioritize. So that takes a lot of care. I do recognize that the Northwest Territories is not just Inuit. You've got First Nations, you've got some Métis, and you've got a lot of other non-Indigenous groups that are there as well. So I feel like I'm rambling here for a second, but to have a territorial advocate would help with this work, because they're there. Or I'm hoping that they would be there. And it was suggested as well by NTI, the Inuit government of Nunavut, that maybe in Northwest Territories might consider having an advocate that is shared between the territories. That's a possibility, just so that you get better economies of scale for such a position. I also recognize that the needs are incredibly dire. I saw firsthand what this is. I saw people in home ownership programs, which was great. But when the homes are already in terrible condition, then there was, how do you parse out fairly the capital funds, because there were capital subsidies. And I saw this in Nunatsiavut, where people who were, had, government jobs and had salaries, and the cost of living so very high, and the cost of utilities was through the roof, that their money doesn't go very far. And then you had people on social assistance who had no opportunities for employment, and they received a lot of subsidies to be able to upgrade their homes, but then those that were working didn't have access because there was a cutoff. So the thought in Nunatsiavut was to really have everything be a sliding scale. So it's not just if you make over a certain threshold, you get nothing, and if you make just underneath that threshold, then you benefit the most compared to everyone else because you still have your income. So there's a lot of solutions, I think, that can be shared amongst different governments up in the north, because a lot of the I think the environment and the things that you're facing can be similar, but then still very nuanced and still very unique as well. There's a lot of great shared ideas. I know there's been a lot of concern about NWT housing and how that is run. And I've been, in my role, I've developed a good relationship with AMA, which is the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in BC. And their director, Margaret Foe, has been really spearheading complex care for housing for Indigenous folks that are off their territories. And she met with the Nunavut government recently, and she might have a lot to offer in terms of how certain changes could happen also with NWT housing to better meet the needs of people. But in the end, it really is, you've got a lot going on.
Mr. Nirsu, do you have a follow-up?
Okay, I'll just make this one short. Are you aware of the emergency housing program, federally funded? That's I was told about this program a couple of years ago when I was working in a different environment, and I was just wondering if you're aware of it and how it could benefit or communities up here in the north where housing is in dire needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wu?
No, I'm not aware of this program. That's something that we need to look into. At this time, as I recognize there are so many gaps in the research and the knowledge, and as well as engagement with direct engagement with people with lived experience in the North, this is an issue of concern for me, and it's something that I want to dive into more. There's a lot of research around large urban centers and what homelessness looks like there, and but I'm going to admit that except for my work with the Inuit in 2 of the 4 regions, I've not done a lot of work in the North directly. But it is not that it's not important, because I think it's so easy to ignore. Thank you for bringing this to my attention.
Thank you. Ms. Yakalaya, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you, Madam Chair. Having heard your presentation, does the Nunavut government have a housing advocate, or are you just working directly with their organization?
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Wu?
Nunavut does not have an advocate. I'm hoping that they do. That was among the recommendations that were co-created by NTI and myself that ended up in my report, as well as the Nunavut government and I have been, advocating at the provincial level of Labrador and Newfoundland government as well to have an advocate. So, that you're considering it, you might be the first. But like I said, NTI, the Inuit government, and Nunavut had suggested, knowing that I was going to appear before you today, that you might consider having talks with the other territories to perhaps have an advocate cover the 3 territories. So that's something that may or may not be useful to you, just to be able to share the resources.
Okay. Ms. Yakalaya, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I guess having housing as a human right in the Northwest Territories, for me, that means for people to, because you can't do anything without a home. You can't go to school, you can't get a job, you can't start a business, there's a lot of you can't. If you don't have adequate housing or a place to live. So having a home means you could be successful, you could be, independent, creating independence. So that's why when we passed the motion, that's what I was thinking about. If you don't, like I said, you can't really take good care of yourself health-wise because you don't have adequate resources to eat properly or to go to school or to get a job or to do all these things. So it became that's what I was aiming for. So for us to have a housing advocate is probably going to be the next steps that we have to do. So that way everybody is, their experiences, they can talk about looking at even at the encampments, people living in tents, people living on the street. When you were talking about encampments, are you only referring to known encampments, or what about the people that are just living in the bush by themselves behind communities in a tent? Do you know about those guys? Is that part of your encampment talk that you gave? Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Wu?
My report on encampments covered, covered a definition of encampments. It's either people formally or informally, legally or illegally living in an improvised structure. So it could be a tent, it could be a tarp, it could be a boat, it could be a car. and where they are there because they have nowhere else to go. We saw encampments in different shapes and sizes across the country from coast to coast to coast. I saw some in Métis settlements in northern Saskatchewan. I saw some people living in improvised shelters in Nain and Hopedale and in Labrador. And so recognizing that encampments is not just a large urban center phenomena, and it's growing, and it's shocking. It's shocking. But my encampments report really still brings down to the fact that people are in encampments because we have failed them. It is a physical manifestation of exactly how broken our housing and homelessness system is from coast to coast to coast. And it is a failure of multiple jurisdictions of governments to not only meet the human rights to housing needs of people, but the basic human rights as well to access to water, safe drinking water, to heat, to cooling in the summer, and to safety and to dignity. And so it's a very complex issue. I was really happy to see that the federal government, again, put together this fund for an emergency response plan for people in encampments that is supposed to prioritize human rights-based approaches. Now, I've started watching this morning because I was only alerted to the fact that you had this meeting with the NWT government around their encampments response, and I saw the committee that was placed, and I know that this is there's a it is an emergency right now because winter's coming, and so that the short-term solution is to get people just somewhere safe, and the long-term solution is adequate housing. What I felt was missing for it to be truly a rights-based approach is that at these committees that are talking about this is really missing the voices of people with lived experience, and I heard through some of the conversation, and I admit I didn't watch the whole thing because I didn't have time before appearing before you today, but that there had been some surveys to identify the needs of people, but people need to be brought into the greater discussion because they're the ones who are able to explain why we have failed, what's missing, why we're assuming for a top-down approach is about making assumptions because we assume everyone's like us or should be like us, and that's not the reality. And so treating people with lived experience as experts, and they are, and paying them well as the experts that they are for helping to best inform the path forward, and really understanding the root causes of things helps cut through a lot. And I'm hoping that will be given front and center stage with some of the solutions moving forward with your encampments crisis in your territory.
Thank you. Thank you. We are here until 11, so if we have more time, we will ask for a second round of questions. But I would like to say something to myself. I know housing advocate is necessary. So when we do get one, who will be funding the position in the NWT? Thank you. Ms. Ho, sorry about that. Okay. That was my question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood that as a question. Could you repeat it, please? I'm so sorry.
Okay. I said, well, housing advocate is necessary in the NWT, and just like what my colleague they said, housing is the foundation because it does have an impact on the well-being of the families. So if the position, for the NWT, the advocacy is really necessary, or for a position in the NWT, if we have one, who would fund that position is what I said. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. That would be the responsibility of the territory to fund a territorial housing advocate. I'm not sure if the federal government could be approached to help fund it. And that was also why I suggested maybe considering working with the other two territories that you have a shared advocate, just to be able to have better economies of scale. It's at the federal level, you know, and I come from community. So I come from the NGOs. There was a charitable organization that I ran in my previous job. And, you know, we rub 2 pennies together and make 4. Things cost a lot, especially with the travel, and to be able to meaningfully engage with people firsthand. And and also to put out the reports, because at the federal level we have a lot of regulations around how things are published on the website and how they're accessible. They have to be translated in French and English. And with my Inuit reports, I also, you know, by the adage of nothing about us without us, I made sure everything was translated in both Inuit dialects. Because, you know, people spoke to me and communicated with me through interpreters, and that I was going to just go publish something about them and what they shared with me in a language that they couldn't understand. So these things cost money. That is, you know, I make no bones about it. But on the other hand, it is really about helping you. And I know you've been working so hard, and I've been listening to, you know, the deputations before this committee. You care, and you're making big investments on how to best address the housing crisis that you're facing. And Housing Advocate hopefully will help you get there with better results, and help advocate at other levels of government as well for help, help lend some of these reports and these discussions in these recommendations at other levels of government as well, to be able to get more funding, but better funding, better targeted funding, and get to the heart of the issues so that these can be addressed. It won't happen overnight. I'm not going to lie to you. There is no silver bullet. The housing crisis has been, and there are many of them, they've been the results of colonialism. They've been the result of financialization. They've been the result of government neglect, you know, over, well, you know, decades and centuries, really. And it's going to take a long time. And it's the breakdown of a lot of other systems as well, you know, about basic income or income assistance, and the breakdown of the systems around health and mental health as well, education, I would say as well, you know, and so it's going to take a lot to fix this, but it has to be focused on as a matter of priority. Governments have a lot on their plates, and you know, I've worked in the housing and homelessness sector for so long, and we would have our day, you know, where we would appear before governments, and all of us together, and voice, you know, our concerns in front of government. And the next day, well, it's another group. They're going to talk about oil, or they're going to talk about something else, and governments have different people appear to them every single day with their issues and trying to prove to government they're the pressing issue of the day. And so it's hard for governments to stay focused. And this is what the advocate would do as well. But it's also to be a bridge so that civil society can be heard. And like I said in my introductory remarks, you know, it allows, I have a privilege of being able to speak to governments in a way that civil society can't. And I have a way of building trust and hearing people in civil society and people with lived experience in a way that governments can't either, because of their position, but also just because of time. So it's really about focus.
Thank you for yes, thank you for the comment. I know that in NWT you said it, and we all said it. We've said it many times, and Indigenous leaders have said it so many times too as well, where in NWT we are in housing crisis. And in small communities, I'm from a small community as well, but I represent 4 communities. So in small communities, there is no housing mortgage. I mean, no housing market, sorry about that. No housing market where we can buy and sell houses freely. So the NWT housing, or house starting with when this government was formed, they built more public housing. They built a lot of public housing unit. And and I know that some of these people, they lived in those units for so many years. And they've been asking, can we have that house? You know, can the housing transfer that unit to us to be a homeowners? And I know that a lot of the people in the small communities, they want to be a homeowner, and they know that living in a public housing, there's no security, you know? Of all the things that you said, you know, like the evictions, and because of the housing policy, when the parents age, you know, they create a homelessness. And also, because this is where a lot of parents raise their families and grandchildren, so they have really close connection with those units. So that I've been hearing lots from my writing and other writing as well in the NWT. And according to this 2022 public housing portfolios that was presented by the JNWT and the government of the Northwest Territories, so they said here in there were 247 public housing units, and of that, approximately 1,428 units are 30 years and over. And that's the one that we're talking about, where, you know, some of them are 50 years old, and government are spending more money to retrofit those houses when it's, you know, they should just, you know, that's what we're advocating for, is that they should just give those houses away and build more houses to accommodate other families. We know that a lot of young people, young families, they would like to move back to the regions, but the problem is the housing. They can't. So we know that, so that, and we, even to retrofit one houses, we'll say, for example, here, from that same report, in Polituck, to retrofit one house, it's over $336,000. In my writing, to retrofit one house, it's $254,000. And recently, a house was retrofitted, and it cost like $280,000. So that's how much the government is spending. But, and to replace a unit in Polituck, 4 units, it's $3.1 million. That was from 2022 fiscal. Even in Bichuco, to replace 2, like that's 100 kilometers, 107 kilometers from here. So to replace 2 units, $1.5 million. We know with the cost of living. So the higher north that you go, there it's going to cost more. So, and in the meantime, so that's why there's about 10 units in my writing that have sat vacant for 10 years, maybe over 10 years, and the government is not doing anything. Like, I mean, people are asking, they want to acquire, you know, they want to take, they would like to see that house transferred to people who lived in it before, or somebody who's willing to retrofit or to fix the units. And it's not just my writing, but other writing as well, where they would like to see that happen. But with this budget here, and we know that the territorial government is not putting a lot of money to maintain the houses. The housing budget is very low to maintain. So many of these houses are beyond repair. A lot of these public units. But we know that there is a difference between the NWT and the South, where with the reserve. In the South, where because of the reservation status, they live on the reserve. They get house money funding for rapid housing, and they can build houses for their members. And in NWT, we get the same money. But what does the GNWT, and this is one of my colleagues have been saying it for so long too, and he's not here with us. He's not part of the social development, but he said it many times, Mr. Jericon. And with the rapid housing, that's for the indigenous and housing built, they don't provide more houses or build more houses for our people. So in the small community, especially in small communities where there's no housing market, you cannot buy and sell. Who would, but that is our home. And that's where we are raising our family. And that's where a lot of people are raising their grandkids. But that is our home. So we're not going to go anywhere. It's just that, and I know the funding money is an issue. So I'm just saying this because it's more of a comment, but if you want to say something to it, but there is a figure here from 2022. I don't think it could happen anytime soon. So that's why we're advocating. We're always advocating. We're always talking about housing issues in the NWT. It's all of us, the regular MLAs. We've said it so many times. And thank you to our colleague from Yellowknife too. They've been saying the same thing for us, trying to help us to get more houses in small communities, because many of the small communities members, they go to Yellowknife because there's more housing. That's what they've been saying. And then because of housing policy, a lot of our people moved to Yellowknife, and then a lot of them are on the street. And so, but it's more of a comment. So if you want to say something, it's, it's up to you. But with the rapid housing, I see that there is a difference between how the rapid housing is being used, allocated from the reservation to the small communities in the Northwest Territories. Thank you. Ms. Hu?
Oh, wow. There's so much I want to say, and I think we're going to run out of time, and I wish I had an opportunity to just sit down and even have coffee with you to even talk some of this out. But first of all, I'm going to start with the Rapid Housing Initiative. What I saw in Pine House in Métis communities in northern Saskatchewan, just even being able to build 10 small row houses with solar panels, because the cost of heating and even keeping places lit was just so exorbitant in northern Saskatchewan. Just having solar panels on them, being more climate resilient, made a huge difference, not just for the 10 people that got to move into these homes, but for the entire community, because these people were in encampments. So, and that people in encampments is really difficult for a community to watch, to be near. And so that these people finally got homes with wraparound services and homes that were safe, where it was theirs. It was a really big deal. So the Rapid Housing Initiative, I think everyone needs to put pressure on the government to say, this, out of all the National Housing Strategy programs, this is the one. And at some point it was threatened. We didn't think that there was going to be more funding. And yet this is the one that makes the most difference when it comes to, progressively realizing the human right to housing and focusing on the people that need it first, not just for the individuals that are housed, but for the entire community as a whole. Of course, this was negotiated through Métis, MNS, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, as well as FSIN, so First Nations as well. And there's a lot of really good collaboration that's happening between the First Nations and Métis in Saskatchewan, which is very unique. For them, they feel that this is the only way that they're going to get things done. When I was in Nunavut, when I was in Pangnirtung, there were treaty or promises, unkept promises to people who were forcibly relocated to that area from areas in the south in order to hold the territory, hold the Canadian frontier, especially during the Cold War. Instead of moving the military there, someone had the bright idea of forcibly moving Inuit up in that area where it's dark 24 hours a day. And one of the promises was $2 a month housing. And that promise was not really held. So that is really, that's something to be looked at. So there's, when it comes to treaties and promises with Indigenous folks, there's a lot of points, there's a lot of advocacy that can be done there. And there's money that should absolutely be transferred there. It's about how best to do it, who should decide, and working directly with Indigenous governments, they all say the same thing. They need to have jurisdiction over that, and they're the ones who would make the decisions over the priorities, and they shouldn't have to compete with the mainstream for things like rapid housing, for example. And then there's the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy that states that there's 80% of people who are Indigenous who are off their territories. And traditionally, the federal government had washed their hands of the responsibility, because the minute that someone who was Indigenous was off their territories because of treaties, the government considered themselves done. The reality is, with UNDRIP and otherwise, is that the government is not done. So the federal government still has responsibility. What does that look like? And, their over-representation of people who are Indigenous in homeless encampments, housing precarity, and homelessness in all areas off their territories as well as on their territories, but it needs to be addressed. So this is a big point of contention. The federal government had promised funding for the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. There is some tension because it's never enough money, and some of the Indigenous governments feel that this is in lieu of giving them the money, and so that it can't be an all or nothing thing. It can't be, a zero-sum game that one is at the expense of another. And this has been always the game about housing, period, regardless of where it is and who's doing it. It's always about robbing Peter to pay Paul. And we can't have Band-Aid solutions anymore. And we can't just, take out a plug and put it somewhere else because it's leaking there, because it's going to just continue to leak, and at some point it's gone. With regards to housing condition in general, of what I've noticed in the North, in Inuit communities that I've been in, is that the housing condition itself is terrible. Even brand new houses that cost a fortune to build, they're not well built because they're built on the cheap. What I noticed in Labrador is houses built on swamps with wood bases without even a blue wrap, and that people experience mold. They're inadequate even to begin with. And it's not that around the world we don't know how to build housing in the North. We've got, I'm friends with the Icelandic ambassador to Canada. In Iceland, they know how to build housing with permafrost. They know how to build. And even when I was in Nain, no, it was in Hopedale. We saw the marked difference between housing that was built for Inuit by the government and then the home that was built for the RCMP, which had a concrete foundation. And it wasn't perfect, but it was like any house that we found here in the South. And it can withstand being in a swamp, and it could withstand the cold, and it could withstand the changing temperatures. But then why was that good enough for the RCMP, but not for Inuits who were promised housing by governments and was a part of an obligation? So you can sink as much money into renovations of a home, but if it's garbage to begin with, you're never going to get there. And when homes are overcrowded, and when there's 16 people living in a home that has 2 bedrooms, and there's no storage space for people to, participate in their cultural practices or their survival, hunting, fishing, appropriate clothing for the extreme weather that you're experiencing, that's a problem. When people are taking shifts in beds, when kids can't be given homework from their teachers because there's no quiet place to go do that, when the rate of violence and sexual violence is just so high and the tensions are so high in the homes and there's no safe place for people. Again, all of these things come to play because people are inadequately housed. And if their houses, like I said, are not well built to begin with, and then we could just blame people, those people don't know how to take care of their homes, no one would be able to maintain their homes if they're not well built to begin with. So that in itself needs to be addressed. And then there's the skills. Do you have the skills? What I saw in Nunatsiavut were a lot of appliances in people's front yards because the homes were shifting. They were getting electrical surges. It was blowing out the appliances. People had to be resilient. They were cannibalizing old appliances in order to fix their appliances. And because you can't just go to Home Depot to get a new stove, for example, and in the way that we can here in the South, and never mind, having the funds to do it. But again, this is not something that people in the South recognize. So when something goes sideways in the North, it has some huge implications and a huge impact, and the result's not going to be immediate. You're not going to be able to fix it quickly, and but you also need the skills. So, and I guess the last point I want to make in terms of home ownership is maintaining a home, regardless of who does it, regardless if it's NWT housing or the individual, it will cost money. It always does. And if it costs money for NWT housing, it will cost that for the homeowner as well. So who's going to pay for that? And is it about sweat equity, which is great? People are meant to toil. People are meant to have something to do and to feel valued and to be able to contribute and to learn and to teach. And to create these opportunities around home maintenance as a collective is huge. And I've seen that in housing co-ops, which has been wonderful, where people teach skills. And even though the homes don't necessarily belong to them, it belongs to the collective. But as a collective, they've also, made decisions and done a lot of things directly to be able to maintain their homes. And so to leverage, to have something that leverages that sweat equity and passes on knowledge, this is fantastic. But without that, it's still going to cost a lot of money to import experts to be able to fix the housing. And then, of course, if there's a housing shortage, where do you put these experts? Where do you house them while they're doing the renovations? So there's a very complex things. But when it comes to home ownership, though, whether it's the Métis or the Inuit, for people that have been forcibly removed from their lands, that have been to be able to own a home or say no one can ever push me off my home ever again because it belongs to me and it is mine, that is really meaningful. And that for me is a step to reconciliation as well. So, in any region, you need the continuum of housing options, from emergency shelters, which are for emergencies, and shelters should never be mistaken for housing. Ever in any conversation. Shelter is for emergencies. It should be, short term and hopefully never recurring. But then you need transitional housing, and then you need permanent housing. And so not everyone's situation is the same, but you can't just invest in one thing. But home ownership is a really important part of this equation as well. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to soapbox on all of this.
Okay, thank you. We do have lots of houses built on swamp and muskeg in the Northwest Territories as well, and there's the house shifts, and there's a lot of issues with, especially with the private homeowners as well. So we do. So now I will go to Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the passion of the advocates. It certainly radiates quite clearly. I mean, it doesn't take much of an effort to see. A blind person could see your passion behind the initiative. Usually that's my Stevie Wonder joke. Even Stevie Wonder can see your passion clear. I think really my question would really be built around, I'll just make one quick point. I'm not sure a shared advocate, although I appreciate the financial resources, makes sense. I think the constant competition for their attention, if it was a shared advocate, would be a problem. I wouldn't say our housing challenges are unique. I think they're tweaked different in the sense of they're slightly different in, say, Pangertung, as you mentioned, you were there. versus say like Old Crow in the Yukon, maybe more similar to us as to Sigachek or even Wrigley. Those are small communities in our sectors. That said, I see us constantly struggling for the attention, and then where does it go next? So, but it's certainly something, a recommendation, or even just a thorough consideration. It's certainly something that would have great value to put some time on thinking about. If it was that route, what could it look like? And the last part of this point is the fact that resourcing at 3 territories wide, unless it was built around a structured commission that really had such a unified office of probably a lot of resources, I mean, it would just, everyone would feel shortchanged. In other words, if we had them, where do you put them? That's a territorial problem you don't appreciate. I'm sure you understand, but I mean, would New Natsivit feel like, well, wait a minute, Yellowknife, why do they have the office here and we only get to talk to the person one time? Or Yukon says, well, we want it in Whitehorse, and we'll come see you when we see you. So it's an enormous undertaking. But the point made is, could we do business differently? And I would say, I think we always have that opportunity. It's just how do we envision and be responsible about it? I mean, ultimately, Madam Chair, I think my question is really, I just want to build a little bit on my good colleague from the Mackenzie Delta, Mr. Narasu's point, which he talked about income support, and he talked about taking productive choices away from people. And so I do have a pragmatic side, which is, hey, it's the old, you give someone a fish, they just expect it. You teach them to fish, they'll fish forever. And I love that saying. You don't have to be religious to appreciate how important that is. In other words, inspire ownership, make people part of the solution, endear them. And I read a study once a number of years ago in Thunder Bay where they had taken a very social community, and I'm referring to basically your form of income assistance and whatnot, and they gave them housing. But one day someone had some idea about trying to empower people by saying, well, hey, we're going to help you paint your fences, and we're going to help you clean up your yards. And all of a sudden the dynamics of the community changed. Now, it didn't change people being in social housing because they needed those supports. But what it did was it created pride, and it instilled value in the sense of like, hey, this is my community. Don't throw garbage here. Don't let your dog do what your dog does over there. This is my area. This is where my kids are. And it didn't mean like they had to own it. But what it did was it changed the dynamics of how people felt. And when you can help connect on how people feel, you can inspire them to be part of the solution. If they're part of the solution, we stand a little taller, we get more excited about life, and, whether we're healthier, and it just goes on. So how do you see, this as we work with those, where responsibility is just a difficult thing to connect? And I recognize, and this is where the question is that I recognize the importance that somebody has to live somewhere. I don't care how you look at it, you have to live somewhere. And I don't know if that's a true definition, but the fact is, gotta be somewhere, and wherever you are. So we have a lot of people who are very difficult to house, and how do you instill some level of responsibility with the state saying, hey, we're going to come in and provide housing, but we have those challenges, and no one wants to really talk about them, and then it gets into this enormous process. And back to wanting to instill some level of partnership, responsibility, and inspiration. Government's constantly dumped on as the ultimate solution of fixing all of these problems. Any thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. And Ms. Hu?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It's a range of solutions. It's when we talk about people that are the hardest to house, we talk about meeting people where they're at. And not everyone is at the same place. And so when we're talking about the continuum of housing options for people, we're talking about sometimes supportive housing. Most people are meant to toil. Most people need to feel useful. They need to feel like they belong somewhere, that they can contribute something, that they have a reason for getting up in the morning. And some people are so deeply harmed and so hurting so much that that's not something that they can think about or not think about on a consistent level. So this is where the supportive housing comes in. You need, all places need a range of options around supportive housing that's not necessarily time limited. And that is providing housing for people that where they can live with dignity and a certain amount of autonomy with a level of support that they need. And for some people, that support is just merely having access to a bank account and learning to pay their rent and learning to keep a place clean and to buy groceries and to cook for themselves. And some of that, it's more light touch. Other people, it's support around understanding the rights and responsibilities of being a tenant or even a homeowner. What that means around being a good neighbor, taking care of the home. And for some people, it's around mental health and addiction. And that's why this is very much, it's not just a housing issue. It is also a mental health issue. And, we are grappling, just I think, torn apart by the opioid crisis. That's really crippled this country, I have to say. And of course, it's attacked people who are most vulnerable first, and it's most visible population, I would say, that's being affected by this. And I know rich people also are affected by the opioid crisis, but probably less so because they might have safer sources to access whatever's satisfying their addiction. But addiction really comes down to trauma. So for some people, they won't get there in their lifetime. Some people will. And for some people, it'll be cyclical, and they'll be okay for a while, and then they will relapse. So as a society, we have to accept that some people will need help on a cyclical basis, and that help needs to be there when they need it, not to be put on a wait list for 10 years, and for them to lose everything or hit rock bottom before they can get help. And then some people will just need help for their entire lives and won't be able to contribute regularly or on schedule because that's just not what they're able to do. But it's really comes down to no one should be left behind, and everyone should be able to live with dignity. And that's where the definition of adequate housing comes in. So their home is habitable, that it is affordable for them, that they have access to everything that they need, and that they can, really get to their full potential for whatever that is. And it needs to be for people that have different needs, regardless of their ability. So whether it's for people that have physical disabilities, or, some of the deputations in front of you have also talked about people that are neurodiverse. All of these things need to be considered. It's complex, and it really is not a one size fits all. But that being said, there is really something about investing in people and not leaving them behind. But at the same time, we need to meet them where they're at. So there's going to be some really amazing success stories about one person got a bit of help and they turned around. And then another success story would be this person was so deeply harmed and they didn't lose their foot to frostbite. They didn't live outside. So it depends on the narrative that you're looking at.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
No, I don't have a follow-up. I just want to thank the witness for comments. I too believe that supportive housing can be dynamic and needs to be dynamic. And I also think that last point I'll make on this is just to close my end off, which is that I often think if we're building a multitude mixed home, we should have a supportive office in these facilities. So to illustrate a little clearer, to make sure the witness appreciates where I'm drawing, is that if we're building say a 30 or 40 unit apartment building that's a multifunctional home and whatnot, I mean, I'm a believer that we have a section in there for supportive living, and whether that's for counseling, whether it's just for and counseling doesn't mean drugs. Counseling could be about life skills. Counseling could. So, I don't think we meet that need, and I've thought about that quite a bit. And And if places like that are reserved within the initial planning, then we'll be building them in a manner of rather at the beginning trying to help people off on the right foot. Obviously, if you're a person who doesn't need those services, I mean, you're walking by the office and go, smell you later. But if you're a person who needs that services, it's within reach, and it's not one of these like I can't find it or I don't know who to talk to. It's just a matter of where your journey fits. So, Madam Chair, I don't have a question. I just want to thank the presenter. I found her presentation very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have many, many more discussions on this topic. Thank you.
Okay. With that in mind, we're running out of time, so I just wanted to ask members if they have any final closing words to say before we end this public briefing. Okay. Ms. Hould, I want to say thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. And there's no other questions, so we will conclude. This concludes the public briefing for housing as a human right. Thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the presentation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay.